Dad. One of my earliest memories of my father is when he extinguished a small fire that I'd caused. I was 3 and fascinated by the electric toaster in the kitchen. I'm not sure what I did, but whatever it was, a fire ignited. And soon big flames were shooting out of the slots of the toaster. My 6-year-old sister and I began screaming. We watched as Daddy ran into the kitchen in his undershirt and boxer shorts and began violently shaking the toaster over the sink, a Lucky Strike dangling from his lips. After a tense moment, he somehow managed to extinguish the flames. "Jesus Christ, what the hell did you kids do?" he shouted. We were uncharacteristically mute, just glad he was there. My father was a smart, decent, and loving man. He was born Bernard Lawrence Glaser in Roxbury, Mass. In 1919. He was the youngest of 3 brothers, known in their neighborhood as the Glaser boys, Milton, Julius, and Bernie. His parents didn't have much money, but managed to put their 3 boys through college. It's a common story for the time. Dad's father, William Glaser, was born Velvel Levi-Yitzhaks in Ukraine in 1885. He was a carpenter. His mother, Esther, was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1893. She was a homemaker. They met after coming to the U.S. in 1903. Esther was just 10 years old when she arrived in New York and married my grandfather 8 years later. Dad told me once that his father was always a good provider, but not particularly affectionate or affirming. He explained that this was apparently the case with many Eastern European Jewish men. Shortly after they married, Willie and Esther moved from the Lower East Side of Manhattan to the Boston area, where they remained for much of the next 4 decades. In their retirement years, they purchased a small house in Maplewood, New Jersey. They had never lived next door to Gentiles. Grandpa referred to it once when speaking with my father outside on the front lawn one day. I was within earshot. "You know, Bernie," he said, sounding almost surprised, "they're nice people." Dad just nodded. My father graduated from Tufts University in Medford, Mass. In 1940. 78 years later, in 2018, I wrote to Tufts and asked for any information they had on his years there. When his records arrived, you could have knocked me over. Although he was on the tennis team for 4 years and a member of a fraternity, what caught my eye in his student records was the recognition he received for his acting and elocution skills. I had no idea. He had certainly never mentioned it. Turns out he was a much lauded student actor. King Richard in Richard III, Malvolio in Twelfth Night, Smirnov in Chekhov's The Boar, and a handful of other significant roles. He also appeared in Tufts' production of the influential 1920 science fiction play R.U.R. by the Czech writer Karel Čapek, which introduced the word robot to the English language. I learned from a cover story in the April 1939 issue of the Tufts Weekly that Dad won the Goddard Prize for Dramatic Interpretation that year. It had been awarded every year at Tufts since 1862 and was considered rather a big deal, bestowed at, quote, the discretion of the Department of Drama for marked excellence in acting, unquote. Yet my father never mentioned any of this. After Tufts, Dad enlisted in the Army as a private and was sent to OCS, Officer Candidate School, at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Early the next year, he was commissioned as an officer in the infantry, transferred to Europe, and became an infantry platoon leader in the 6th Armored Division of the 3rd Army. Dad didn't talk about those days much either. But after his death in 1981, I found this paragraph about his division on a military history website. 6th Armored Division battle record in 1945. After a short period of rehabilitation, the division resumed the offensive, penetrated the Siegfried Line, crossed the Prüm, reached the Rhine River at Worm on 21 March and set up a counter-reconnaissance screen along its west bank. The 6th crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on 25 March, drove on to Frankfurt, crossed the Main, captured Bad Nauheim, and continued to advance eastward, and surrounded and captured Mulhausen on 4 and 5 April. After repulsing a light counterattack, it moved forward 60 miles to cross the Saal River and assisted in freeing Allied prisoners of war and the German concentration camp at Buchenwald. The National Military Personnel Records Center, St. Louis. My father had originally planned to become a pilot in the Army Air Corps, but changed his mind after fainting during a flight training exercise, saved only by the quick instincts of his instructor, who pulled the single-engine plane out of a dive. I still have a copy of a diary he kept at that time. On one page he wrote, "I'm so disappointed in myself." Yet my father went on to significant success in the military and was discharged as a first lieutenant at the end of the war in 1945. He was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action for pulling his wounded men to safety during a firefight. I still have that Silver Star on my wall today. He was called back 5 years later during the Korean War, promoted to the rank of captain, and assigned an administrative job in the Pentagon. He never set foot in Korea. After the war, my father built a career in journalism as a magazine writer and editor at Time and elsewhere. And by the early 60s, he was working for Bill Safire, the public relations guru, Nixon speechwriter, and later a powerful political columnist for the New York Times. My father once told me it turned out that the Nixon White House was tapping Safire's phones when he worked there. The story infuriated Safire for a long time. Dad taught me a way of thinking about the journalistic process that I've often remembered. I'd begun working on Daltonian, the student newspaper at my high school, and I described the sense of pressure I felt while I was writing on deadline. Once, when I was writing a Daltonian review of the controversial and explicit 1967 Swedish film I Am Curious Yellow, I remember fearing that I'd gotten in over my head. My father listened, and then he recalled his own early days in the news business. He said, "Son, everyone has their own job in the newsroom, no matter how big the operation. Everybody pulls his weight, and then it happens. It all comes together. It's magic. A newspaper is a daily miracle, and a news magazine is a weekly miracle." Over a number of years, relatives of mine had mentioned to me that when my father was a magazine editor in the late 50s and early 60s, he was of significant help to the African-American writer Alex Haley, who went on to write the worldwide bestseller Roots, as well as several other well-known books. I could not find any evidence of this for years until one evening in 2023, I did an online search with just the right keywords, and up came an article that at long last proved the story was true. In the August 1980 issue of Writer's Digest magazine, Haley was interviewed about his early days when he was just starting as a writer. "I was still quite used to getting rejection slips. One day I met a writer named Glenn Kittler. He wrote for numerous publications. I tried to give him all the help I could. I was in public relations at the time. And in the course of lunch, I was telling him about my dreams to write one day. At the time, I felt like touching his coat, thinking that he'd bought that coat with money he'd made writing. It just seemed awesome. He was very nice, extremely affable. I told him a number of vignettes I'd heard in the Coast Guard. And he said to me, 'You know, Bernie Glaser, the editor at Coronet, is buying one-pagers of material like that, short historical vignettes like the ones you've told me. They run about 600 words apiece, and they pay $100 each, which is today about $1,000. Why don't you try writing some of them?' Come Christmas, I spent the entire period writing these vignettes for Glaser, not one, but 4, and bundled them off to him with a letter saying that I had met Glenn Kittler and that he suggested Coronet might be interested in my vignettes. About 3 weeks later, the phone rang. It was Bernie Glaser. He asked, "Is this Alex Haley?" "Yes," I said. "Well, this is Bernie Glaser of Coronet," he said. I remember I was standing up at the phone, and when it hit me who he was, I just froze. And then I sat down, plop. I will never forget it. He said, "Where have you been? We have a real need for this kind of stuff. We're going to buy 3 of your vignettes. The 4th one is lousy." And that was the beginning of my first real relationship with an editor, where I got to know him as a person. Not too long thereafter, Bernie invited me up to his office. I went, full of nervousness and anticipation, and there was Bernie in the flesh, a real-life editor, who sat down and talked to me about writing. Over the period of the next 3 years, I wrote 30 or so of those one-pagers for Coronet. Well, I felt quite proud of my father after reading the article. In the early 1970s, Dad was working for 2 movie companies, Avco Embassy Pictures and National General Pictures, in the department then called Publicity, Promotion, and Exploitation. In 1969, while at National General, he helped to design the one-sheet posters used to advertise a groundbreaking film about the lives of gay men called The Boys in the Band, based on Mark Crowley's play from the year before. He showed me the ad in his office one day. I looked at it, but I didn't have anything to say. It's not that I was trying to hide my feelings about the poster. I was already out to him by that time. But I was ignorant about the dynamics of movie advertising, and I'm embarrassed to say now I didn't view the campaign for the film as important. Later, that campaign was publicly criticized for being insensitive toward homosexuals, but that was after my father's death. The film was groundbreaking for its subject matter when it was made, and when the play on which it's based was first produced. But its treatment of its topic was already dated by the time of its release. It portrayed a small group of gay men, some of whom were self-loathing. Lines like, "Show me a happy homosexual and I'll show you a gay corpse." But by then, the Stonewall riots had placed everything in a new light. The Boys in the Band very quickly came to be regarded as camp, and today it's regarded as a fascinating period piece. In the early 1960s, before I was out even to myself, I was sitting in my father's living room and overheard one of his Sunday afternoon guests tell a joke. "Hey, did you hear about the new TV series? It's called Space Fag, or Can a Boy from Mars Make It on Uranus?" I wasn't offended, though I suppose I should have been. Actually, because of my childish sense of humor, I found it funny, even though I knew I wasn't supposed to because it used the word fag. In the period immediately after I came out to my father, he continued to use the common vernacular when labeling homosexuals. I don't think he realized how negative it was, especially coming from him. When he transitioned from public relations to the film business and was dealing with movie critics, I remember asking for his opinion of the syndicated film critic Rex Reed, with whom he interacted and who seemed very gay indeed. My dad said, "He's okay, he's a fag, but he's a nice fag." I didn't take my father's use of the word fag as an attempt to offend me. He was simply accustomed to using that word, like so much of the world at the time. As the years passed, though, he finally stopped and switched to the word gay. On balance, I'd say my father had less of an issue with someone becoming homosexual than he did with a person who was passive or weak or lacking in self-respect. He had high regard for the out gay writers of the time, like Gore Vidal and James Baldwin. And even when Muriel's colleagues, those Queenie window dressers at Henry Bendel, came to their apartment for dinner, Dad never ridiculed them or was patronizing toward them. I think he found them amusing, and so did I. I saw my father react with utter disdain and derision toward a gay person only once in my life. It was in 1963. I was 10, in the 6th grade, and was spending a Saturday doing errands with my dad. One of the stops was at a branch of a historic men's apparel store called Rogers Pete, located in Rockefeller Center. Dad needed several small items. The salesman who waited on us was quite effeminate and perhaps a bit overbearing. For whatever reason, my father repeatedly used an abusive tone when interacting with him. Dad seemed to be exasperated with him no matter how innocuous the exchange. Sorry, we don't have that in your size, or will there be anything else, elicited surly derision from my father. It wasn't until years later that I remembered the incident and wondered if my father was worried that I, too, was gay or that I would be when I matured. Did he, even when I was still very young, somehow intuit that I wasn't like him or the men he knew? I loathed team sports and was plainly more sensitive than many of the other boys at school. Did he somehow sense I was different even before I did? Was he uncharacteristically rude to the salesman to send a message to me? Whenever I went to Dad's apartment on Sunday afternoons, he'd be watching golf or football. Until he injured his shoulder, my father had always been an excellent tennis player. He'd played steadily since childhood, and as I said, he competed for the Tufts University team for each of his 4 years there. I knew as a small boy that Dad wanted me to be interested in sports. I never was, and I truly had zero interest in faking it. One exception was downhill skiing, the rare sport for which I had any aptitude. Once, when I was 8 or 9, Daddy put together an impromptu softball game in one of the ball fields at the apartment complex where I lived. A good number of kids I knew joined in, but I could not have been less interested. One of the reasons I never liked team sports was because of the pressure I felt when expected to be part of any team. I lacked the confidence I thought others had when they played. Eventually, I walked up to my father, who was pitching, and told him calmly that I was going to go home and take it easy. And he said, "Gab, I did all this for you. You're why I set up the game. Now you go stand there in the outfield, and if a ball comes your way, you catch it and throw it back, okay? But don't go home yet." "Sure, Dad," I said, not realizing then that what was at stake for my father was probably more than just a baseball game. Arguably, he was trying to get me to be one of the guys. In other words, heterosexual. But I wasn't like those other boys and never would be. I was different in the fundamental ways that many gay boys are different at that age. Still, I wondered why he had pushed so hard for softball that day. In fact, mine was not an aversion to athletics so much as a discomfort with team sports, any team sport, something many other gay men recall from their own childhoods, I have learned. By contrast, I remember accompanying my mother to the combination beauty parlor exercise spa near our apartment in 1961 when I was 8 years old. Nothing fancy, just a neighborhood place where local women went for hair care and light exercise. I could tell that the gentleman in charge was somehow different from other men, very well groomed, in shape, not especially effeminate, but still there was something different about him. Think of a Broadway chorus dancer of that period dressed entirely in black. I could sense that all the women looked to him for his judgment, whether about their hairdos or their accuracy and form during exercise. Once, he asked my mom if I'd like to try the overhead bars when she finished. I was thrilled. A horizontal ladder was suspended from the low ceiling. He gave me a lift up to the bar, and I hung on easily to each rung as I effortlessly made my way across the room. What's more, when I was finished, I could hear sounds of praise from all the women under the hair dryers below me. "Oh, look how easy that was for Meryl's son," that sort of thing. So I escorted Mom there a few more times, and I associated that space with fun and praise. I felt comfortable there. It had a very different vibe for me than the Little League ball field. It was one of my first memories about feeling good in what was effectively a gay male space. Toward the end of his life, my father admitted to me that his best friend, Phil Doyle, knew I would be gay, even when I was pre-adolescent. He told me, "You know, Phil always knew. He used to tell me to be careful about you. He'd say, 'Bernie, watch out, or he's going to be a fairy.'" I reminded him that once, when I was really young, he, Phil, and I were walking through Peter Cooper Village to First Avenue, and when we got there, I assumed we would want a taxi. So I held out my hand and one stopped. And Dad said, "I guess you did that with your mother." But it turned out they did not want a cab that time, and my father waved off the driver. I reminded my father of his prior telling of the story. I told him, "As the cab drove away, Daddy, you said to the driver, 'Never mind, my son is just drying his nails.'" And he and Phil laughed. My father said he couldn't remember what had happened that day so long ago, but he did say, "I owe you an apology, son. I was a jerk to do that, and I'm really sorry." I assured him that he shouldn't worry about it, that it was fine. I had a thicker skin than that, and maybe I was girly. Good for me for being myself, I thought. Dad had smoked heavily since his teenage years, Lucky Strike and Camel, unfiltered. In 1981, he was diagnosed with small cell carcinoma, a fast-growing type of lung cancer commonly caused by smoking. When the doctors made the diagnosis, they told him that the cancer had already metastasized to his brain and estimated that he had 6 months to live. They were right. He was 62. I loved my dad and still miss him.